Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. Our indie comic extravaganza review continues. Earthbound Part 2 has arrived. Let's talk about it. This is a very nice book. I have to make a disclaimer, I think, before I say anything beyond that. And that is that I have worked with Narwhal for the past 3 years, I think, collaborating on writing projects. I consider Narwhal to be a friend. I think he is an excellent writer with, of course, his own quirks, his own strengths and weaknesses, but all in all, excellent writer. I think he is a great artist. I think he is a very unconventional storyteller. I am proud to be able to work with him, and certainly that pride and that friendship is going to color this review. Just be aware of that. Let's talk about the presentation of his book, because this is a very nice book. It's perfect bound, by which I mean perfect as an adhesive, not as, it's a perfect binding or anything like that. But it's perfect bound. It is a pretty good cover stock here. This is a nice card quality cover here. The interior has a very nice kind of a art book feel to it. This is not a high gloss paper like you might find in a magazine, but it is a very nice quality of paper. It feels great in the hand. It shows the color well. It's not too glossy. I'm actually not a big fan of very glossy interior pages. I think they make the book hard to read. They tend to throw a lot of glare. So all in all, great physical product. Artistically, this is the best Narwhal art we have seen yet. That's not surprising, considering that Narwhal has been, of course, improving for the past couple of years. I think that people already familiar with Narwhal's style know that he is a very color-driven, very shape-driven, very movement-driven artist. There are these great frantic action panels. There is a lot of movement even in his exposition scenes, where there is very little going on but talking. Let me see if I can find one of those here. So we have this exposition scene here where, I mean, it's really just people talking, but there's still a lot of stuff going on in the background. That's very nice, very pleasing to see. Now, Narwhal has a very simple style. He does a lot of his defining of depth and shape, not through rendering or very heavy line work, but rather through color and shading, and the general form of motion on the panel, and that is going to be to taste. I think that it's very, very nice to look at. Other people may not like it as much. Certainly, it looks very simplistic on the page, at least at first glance. If you study it, there is quite a bit going on in there, again, especially in the shading. I think Narwhal has a very strong understanding of lighting and of form and how those lead the eye and how those things compose a story on the page. And he makes great use of that. In his previous book, Foreign Agent, that was a black and white book, basically. And there was a lot of very interesting stuff done with shading in that. And now that I have read that, and I've gone back and actually reread Earthbound Part 1, and looking at Earthbound Part 2, I can see a lot of that same stuff happening in here with color added to the mix, which is very impressive. So this book artistically is not going to be what people are used to seeing, I think, but it is a very well illustrated book. The one thing that may confuse people is there is a certain degree of same face in some of these crowd scenes. And I'm not sure how much we're supposed to be able to tell all the people in some of these big crowded high school scenes apart. But it can be difficult to track who is who. Although most of the characters have very definitive designs, in these big crowd scenes, there are so many extras running around. It can get a little bit confusing, especially given the somewhat simple nature of the art in those crowd scenes. And it's going to be, I think, whether it will impact your enjoyment or not. I think it is a weakness of the art that it can be so easy to lose track of characters in these crowd scenes. I don't know, as you really need to track everyone in these crowd scenes in order to get the full impact of the story. So in that respect, I think it's not as big an issue, but looking at it strictly as a piece of visual storytelling, I think it's a weakness. And I think that while Narwhal likes these big chaotic moments in stories, I think that if he's going to continue to do them, he will need to work a little bit more on drawing a crowd scene where you can track who everyone is at all times. And I think that is not a deal breaker, certainly. The story is, as I said, still intelligible. It's still a fun read, but yeah, some of those crowd scenes, trying to figure out what's going on can be a bit of a headache. And it's not a deal breaker. It's just a thing that happens, I think, and is a consequence partly of Narwhal's style and how he approaches visual storytelling. So certainly something there for him to think about, but not a deal breaker by any stretch of the imagination. And I really like a lot of other aspects of the visual storytelling. You wouldn't think, just looking at how loose and sometimes sketchy the art can be here, that Narwhal would do as much with expression and with very subtle unspoken acting. I mean, like having your characters emote off of the page. He does quite well. Here's a pretty simple, I don't know how well you can see that example of that, where we see WizKid and some of the other characters, and their expressions are pretty subtle, and they go along well with the situation and the character's goals, and that is something I think that Narwhal has worked on developing in his last couple of books. I think that his character's acting is more subtle than even in Foreign Agent, which was very reliant on those kind of character acting moments. And I think that's a real, very meaningful improvement that he's had over the last couple of books of his that I've read, because having that kind of ability to have your characters just emote, not speaking, not acting in overly exaggerated ways on the panel, but just emoting through simple use of lighting and expression and mood is really a valuable storytelling tool that Narwhal has developed over his last couple of books, and which I hope to continue to see develop as he develops as an artist. Very, very useful, very impactful visual storytelling in the way he has his characters act and emote. So yeah, all in all, I think the art here is Narwhal's best. It shows all of his idiosyncrasies, of course, and whether you like those idiosyncrasies or not is a matter of taste. I definitely enjoyed the art in here. Let's talk about this story. And it goes without saying, perhaps, but this is Earthbound Part 2. Now, there is a previously on, and there are a few pages that recap some of the basic stuff. And I was interested as a reader and as a writer as well to see how Earthbound Part 2 would read. I just picked it up, opened it, and read what is in this volume. And it is a rough experience. The recap gives you just enough to go on, but I had a hard time remembering the basics of the characters' personalities, and a lot of the nuances of the situation they were in were a little bit lost on me. Now, I struggled through to the end, and then I went back and I reread Earthbound Part 1, and then I reread this. And I think that, no, I don't think that. I know that this is much better if you have just read Part 1. So, if you bought this and you didn't get Part 1 with it, and you hadn't read Part 1, I don't know what you were thinking, buying something labeled Part 2 and not getting Part 1. And I think to a certain extent, that's on you. But the story is very hard to follow along with in the first 20 or 30 pages if you haven't gone back and reread Part 1. I don't have a problem with that, personally. It is fine to have, in my opinion, books that are essentially Part 1 and Part 2 of a bigger story, where you are kind of expected in engaging with Part 2 to have read Part 1. I know that every book is somebody's first, and there is a recap here that makes it possible to parse the events of Earthbound Part 1 and get a basic idea of who's who and what's what. You will not be prepared to engage with the characters or all of the intricacies of their situation if you haven't read Part 1 within a fairly close time period of reading Part 2. And that is just the way the story is. It's a pretty complicated story. There are a lot of moving parts in here. I think that, and it's pretty long. Like, this is about 100 pages of story in this book. 120. I know that for Narwhal, the sweet spot is really 120 pages, I think, of illustrated story. And this is what he hits that, and he does a really great job of wrapping up this story. He can't also recap Part 1 in that time period. I just don't think that's feasible, and I think that's fine. I have no problem with, especially since it is just 2 parts. There can be a sequel to Earthbound, but there is no Earthbound Part 3. Earthbound Between Two Breaths on Earth is a finished story, and it is finished in a satisfying and interesting way. Let's talk a little bit about the actual conclusion of the story. The premise here is that we have 2 people, Spaceman and Julia, and they are competing to basically brainjack competitors for some kind of space Grand Prix that is coming up. We don't know a whole lot about the event itself. We only know that Spaceman and Julia are working on behalf of the 13th sponsor. We don't know a whole lot about the 13th sponsor. All of these things are just kind of MacGuffins to keep the plot moving. What really needs to happen is Julia and Spaceman need to recruit a select group of aliens on Earth, and whoever gets more wins their freedom, essentially. And as a bonus round, Spaceman and Julia have a previous associate known as WizKid, who is also on Earth and a potential tiebreaker kind of a target. And all three of these characters, Spaceman, Julia, and WizKid, have been players in the story basically from minute one. WizKid wants off Earth. He's not happy that he got stranded here several years ago, but he doesn't really want to be necessarily a competitor for the 13th sponsor either. And of course, Julia and Spaceman both don't want to be minions of the 13th sponsor either, so they're trying to basically work their way out of some kind of debt. That part is a little bit unclear. I also don't think it's something we need to understand beyond they're under this guy's thumb. They don't want to be under this guy's thumb. Pretty straightforward motivation. So the build-up, a lot of the build-up is in part one. And then we have about another 20 pages, 30 pages, maybe as many as 40 pages of build-up here in part two. And there is actually a big opening action sequence at a school dance where some of these aliens, the five sisters of something, they're laying low in this Earth High School, and a lot of the regular people are just sort of caught in the crossfire as Spaceman and Julia come in with these brainjack guns, and there's a lot of interesting gambits and an examination of what happens if somebody gets brainjacked by both guns at once, and so there's a lot of setup. And then the last 2/3 of this book, really, or if you prefer, the final third of the Earthbound story in total, is what I would call a Sanderlanche. Now, if you're not familiar with that, Brandon Sanderson is a pretty well-known and well-respected science fiction and fantasy author, and he has a tendency to set up a lot of interesting powers and interactions and goals and motivations and factions over the beginning of one of his stories, and then over the last 1/3 to quarter, it's just a series of gambits and desperation plays and counter plays, and basically all the setup plays out in a very condensed part of the story, which his readers refer to as a Sanderlanche, an avalanche of Sanderson gambits. And the end of Earthbound feels a lot like a Sanderlanche. Everybody has their game in place. Julia and Spaceman start by making their plays, and then WizKid takes his own hand in it. He has his own set of allies that he has been quietly building up, and ultimately, one of them, not all of them, there's no uniting against a common threat or any of this stuff. One of them eventually wins out. Eventually, all of the gambits are played, and all of the free will games are played, and the brainjack guns are used up, and one person comes out and gets away from Earth. I'm not going to tell you who it is. It is interesting to go on that ride and get there, and it's a lot of fun. I'm not even remotely sure that all of the gambits hold up. I don't think that it really matters, because one of the interesting aspects of a Sanderlanche is that there is so many different gambits and ploys and stratagems unfolding at once that nobody was prepared for them to interact in this way in the first place. So nobody has planned for this, and as these gambits and as these counterplays and as these stratagems all work their way out, you realize that all of the players, their initial plans stop mattering after about 5 pages. And then they are just reacting and trying to get their original plans back in play for most of the climax of the story. And Narwhal does that pretty well. And he has, excuse me, has a bunch of interesting gambits going on. He has a bunch of very competent players in place, and I could see just about any outcome coming out of his kind of gambit climax here. I don't have a problem with the outcome we got. I'm not sure that I could sit here and analyze every step that got us here and say, well, it makes sense. But I think that's fine in this kind of storytelling, because the kind of gambit roulette that you play in a Sanderlanche results in a very difficult to parse story anyways. And maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. Certainly, the Sanderlanche is a thing that Brandon Sanderson is sometimes criticized for, because it is very difficult to follow all of these unfolding gambits and stratagems and ploys through the course of the climax. But it is very exciting, and it's very fun to read. And I think Earthbound has that excitement and has that fun at the climax of the story. And at the end of it, if you're a little bit confused and you don't know how all the pieces played out, you can go back and reread it. Like I said, I've read this twice now. I still really can't fully articulate how all the different gambits and ploys play off each other, or even necessarily what they were. But I'm still really satisfied with the ending, because I do feel like there was a stratagem in place for every player, and if they didn't make the best decisions to get to their goal, and if they were really confused by the situation, and if they were making good decisions but not great decisions, I think that's fine, because in a highly chaotic, multi-sided situation, no one is going to be making the best decisions unless they're like Lex Luthor or something like that. And nobody in Earthbound is supposed to be on that level. So it is fun. It is entertaining. The kind of gambit roulette that plays out here may not be to your taste. You may enjoy a plot that is a little simpler, has fewer parts in play, but where each of those parts is executed on in a much clearer, much more deft fashion. And I can understand that. That is not Narwhal's storytelling. Narwhal's storytelling is very gambit and stratagem and ploy heavy, and I think that Earthbound really pays that off. And if that is not to your taste, maybe don't pick up Earthbound. Maybe pick up Foreign Agent instead, which has a much clearer and simpler set of payoffs that you can track a lot easier. Personally, I think that Earthbound is a really fascinating story to read. It is a great example of a kind of Sanderlanche storytelling model in comics. And, Narwhal is a very experimental storyteller in a lot of ways, not just visually. And I am glad to have read this and seen him experiment with this kind of really complicated and sometimes murky set of Gambit-based storytelling. I really like it. I don't know as I would want to read this every story, but one of the things I know about Narwhal is he is always looking for a new kind of story and a new approach to storytelling to take as he works on comics. So I know that not every story I get from him is going to be Earthbound. In fact, Earthbound is probably going to be unique. And I think it's really valuable to have as a reference material to read, to think about, and to examine the setups and the payoffs that he manages to work in here over his 240 pages of storytelling. Very good stuff. I enjoyed it. I would give this a recommend for anyone who enjoys either science fiction, not the hard science fiction where everything is a well thought out extrapolation of modern technology, but rather a kind of softer science fiction where the idea is to look at ideas about people and how they behave through the lens of weird science. And if you like that, if you like Gambit-driven stories, if you like really complicated ploys and interactions, you will also enjoy Earthbound. And I think anybody who enjoys frenetic visual storytelling will enjoy Earthbound as well. So definitely a book worth checking out if you fall into either of those three categories. Otherwise, maybe it's not for you. I think that Foreign Agent is a much more approachable story. It is a very clear and enjoyable story as compared to something like Earthbound. But especially if you are interested in Narwhal's ongoing development as a visual storyteller, like I said, there's visual storytelling stuff going on in here that I've not seen in anything else he's done. So I think it's worth owning for that alone. And it's the Gambit Roulette is very entertaining as well. So I do recommend this book provisionally if you like certain things. But this is not, I think, a book for everyone, which is fine. Again, it's doing something very specific, and I think it does that thing very well. There is also a bonus story, The Naked Samurai Part 2, as it's called. So we have the Naked Samurai shorts after both parts of Earthbound. They're both entertaining. I think I like the original better than this second one, but they are both interesting, fun little side stories that are interesting to think about, interesting to look at, and kind of set up a mythology. And that mythology may actually be explored more in another book, a book I have actually worked on, and I'm kind of excited about, but less said about that the better, because, well, as a person who worked on the book, I should probably allow my work there to stand on its own. Anyway, at the end we have a fascinating examination of Narwhal before comics and after comics, and a reminder that yes, this lifestyle is a drug, and it's not probably the greatest thing for you. Anyways, a really great book. I like it, but then again, I like Narwhal, I like what he does, and I like working with him. So keep all that in mind as well as you think about this book. Let me know what you thought of Earthbound in the comments below if you've read it. There are a like button and a subscribe button down there you can use as you see fit, and I will talk to you later.